stay curious with us on a mini conference that we call Celebrating 50 Years of the Apollo Soyuz Test Project, Peace in Earth Orbit. And to my left here is Mr. Jay Honeycutt. Hi, Jay. Thank you for being here. And Mr. John Tribe over there. And, of course, Mr. Honeycutt, former Kennedy Space Center director. But 50 years ago, when he was a young man, he was a mission simulation expert or manager, I guess it would be, under the tutelage of Chris Kraft at Johnson Space Center, throwing the monkey wrenches at these guys. So we're going to hear a little bit about Jay, experience with Apollo Soyuz Test Project there. And 50 years ago, Mr. John Tribe, who's one of our, both these gentlemen, great supporters of our museum. Mr. Tribe was an English, still is English, of course, but engineer that came from across the pond, early days of our program, and worked on the hypergolic fuels. And we've specifically asked Jay to talk about the near-death experience that these three American astronauts had upon the splashdown of the last command module of the Apollo era on there. So welcome both of you gentlemen. Again, they're tremendous supporters of the American Space Museum. We are kind of going to be freewheeling a little bit with this. They've got in their mind what they want to get across, and they don't have a clue what's in my mind. Nobody does. But we're going to have a little fun here. And if you've got questions, Raj is on the board there to answer your questions, those of you enjoying this as we stream live on our YouTube channel. So, Jay, any opening remarks, sir?
Well, I think I had one slide that I was going to put up here.
Speak up and get the volume up on this for these gentlemen.
No, not that one. Not that one. Not that. There we go.
Okay.
I was going through my Facebook this morning or emails or something, and this popped up on one. I thought, well, gee, how appropriate is that? My thought was I thought Steve did an excellent job of sort of how this came about and the steps that made all this event happen. I was going to kind of come at it from the point of view of a working level guy that was down in the bottom of the organization trying to make sure that we were successful. So the majority of my comments will be more from a personal observation point of view than a technical discussion of this, that, or the other. Mark mentioned this menu here from this meeting in 1975, and if you look at the menu, it's pretty clear that this was at Bernard Cerf, which was a favorite spot of all the Russians when they came down here, or for any reason whatsoever. They all wanted to go to the Cerf. The last time was in 1995 when there was a 20-year anniversary thing of the flight, and everybody came down here, and we went to the Cerf. And there's some artifacts of that up on the wall in Rusty's. If you go in Rusty's out at the port and look up on the wall on your right, you see. I think you see some pictures of that. That event, which Peggy and I were fortunate enough to attend, and was a pretty cool event. The other thing, if you put the other slide up, this is this artistically designed chart here is the only one I have, and its intent to kind of give you a sense of what was going on in mission control when this flight was going on. And the first, all these pre-meetings with all the big shots, primarily in Washington and Moscow, had all been taking place, all the right documents had been signed, all the go-aheads had been given, and it was kind of like, well, okay, let's go get this thing done. And the first, we'll call joint meeting, was held in 1972, and I think Steve had that on one of his charts. There's some differences of opinion, I think, or in the documentation relative to how the various working groups were named. In my memory, Working Group 0 was the thing that was run by Glenn Lunny, and Working Group 1 was the Ops Working Group, and that was run by Pete Frank, who was another one of the flight directors, and all the stuff that we were involved in all took place under sort of the cover of a working group that Pete Frank ran. There were other groups having to do with hardware development and hardware test and this, that, and the other that the engineering team were conducting. But from an operations point of view, we were basically Working Group 1. And in July of the other thing is that what I was doing at that time was I was in the mission simulation area, and we were doing mission simulations for the Mission Control Center and the flight crews. And what they consisted of was running practice missions, in which we put all the crews in their simulators. We put the flight controllers on their consoles, and then we ran practice missions. Our system would provide all the appropriate acquisitions and loss of signal at all these ground stations that he listed around the country, because in those days there was no satellite tracking data relay satellites like you have today that provide constant communication to the vehicle no matter where they are. So we would provide all that stuff, and then we would put problems in that were designed to force the crew to develop confidence in the people on the ground, and the people on the ground to develop a relationship with the crew where they could be trusted to give advice and have it taken. So we did that for all the flights. We did it for all the phases of the flights: launch phase, on orbit activities, lunar activities, re-entry activities, all those kinds of things we would do for each one of the flights. And then in July of '72, which was the first joint mission that we had with the Russian team, in the control center, Apollo 17 hadn't yet flown. It didn't fly until December, so we were involved in mission simulations for 17. The Skylab program was due to launch the following May, May of '73, and we were developing and actually running simulations on Skylab to develop the flight control team cadre that would be responsible for executing those missions. And then they dropped on top of that, they dropped in, well, go figure out how to fly this joint mission with the Russians while in your spare time. So that's kind of what the level of activity that was going on in the control center. We were pretty much all the sim people were pretty much involved in all of them. Barry and his brother didn't see a great deal of me for much of that time frame, because we were pretty well in the control center every day, except maybe Sundays, and then on Sundays we were trying to figure out what we're going to do next week. So it's a busy time. It's a great time. Wouldn't trade it for nothing in the world, but next to my family and my beautiful bride, it was pretty cool. So what did that involve? Well, first of all, we had to decide how we were going to do the simulations, because the Russians ran out of a control center in Moscow. Their crews trained in Star City, which was on the outskirts of Moscow, which was about a 25 or 30-minute drive one place to the other. Our crews were down here at the Cape in their simulators, and our flight control team was in Houston in the Mission Control Center. So we had to figure out how to hook all those 4 places together without benefit of those overhead satellites that we have now. So we strung a lot of wire across and across Europe and under the waters to get them all tied together. But lo and behold, we did it with some really bright people in the communications world that hooked those 4 things up, and without a noticeable delay in other words, if you spoke something, you could almost hear it everywhere else instantaneously. There was a minor delay, but it wasn't anything would be noticeable. So the first meeting that I remember was going to Russia, to Moscow. We always try to go over there in the summertime, obviously, and it was really my first trip ever being out of the U.S. And my first overseas flight was in the middle seat in the next to last row in a 707 from Houston to Paris, which was a long time in that little bitty. I wasn't quite as small as I am now, and so then we went into Moscow the next day. First day out, we got a tour of their control center, which amazingly enough looked just like the one in Houston, except it was a little bit bigger. Had an extra row of consoles. It had one more plot board and bigger plot board, and had a bigger viewing room in the back, but otherwise looked just like ours. And we thought, well, that's interesting. And then we would go to the meetings, and the meetings were all the ones I participated in were like 3 weeks long. There was we, the working group 1 guys, would go over, and we'd spend 2 weeks working with our counterparts and getting everything planned, and then the big guys, Lunny and the crew, would show up for the 3rd week, and we'd go through what we were recommending as a result of the previous 2 weeks. And it was always interesting because we'd meet the first 2 weeks. We'd meet in this, I'll never forget it, in this room. It was about the size of this, and it had a big I-beam thing that went across the room, except it was about this much shorter than the room was wide. In the last 2 feet, they had these steel plates laid one on another and welded together and stuck up to cover the whole length of the room. And you looked outside, and all you saw was grass that was way up and trash, litter everywhere you could look. And then the 3rd week would start, and you'd come in amazingly on Monday morning. You were in a different room. You looked outside, the grass was mowed, and all the litter was all picked up, and they were making a show for the big boys how clean the place was. The other thing that was interesting is you rode around Moscow, and literally, I mean, it was a big city. Literally, you'd see 1,000 of these big construction cranes, because this was in 1975, so they were just coming really out of out of the war, you see these big construction cranes everywhere, all over town, but you never saw one move. And so I asked my counterpart one day, how come I never see them move? He said, we only got one driver, So they have they had a good sense of humor. I mean, they were great. They were great people. They were great to work with us. As Steve mentioned, the negotiations were not difficult in the sense of they didn't want to do what we wanted to do, or we didn't want to do what they wanted to do. The hang-up was in the communications, because we had to use interpreters. Nobody on our team had ever been in any situation where they were required to use an interpreter. So you keep talking over them and talk before they get done, because as he said, 4 words in English sometimes ended up being 40 in Russian as they tried to cross the border. The other thing was interesting was almost all our interpreters were provided by the State Department, and they were almost all I guess they called them white Russians. There was people whose families ran from Russia in 1917 when the revolution happened. They all were kids of families that beat it out of Russia when the communists took over. So they were not particularly sensitive to the Russians' feelings in some cases. And for example, we went there. We say that Dr. Robert Goddard was our invented rockets, basically, and they say it's Tsiolkovsky was the Russian, and then there was a German, Herbert Oberth. In Germany, all 3 in the 20s and 30s were experimenting with rockets, and there's a big debates always over who was first. And of course, we think Goddard was. The Russians think Tsiolkovsky was. So on the weekends, they would give us things to do, and so they took us to Tsiolkovsky's museum in the little town of Kaluga, which is about an hour and a half or so drive out of Moscow to see his museum. And the interesting thing with that is we were outside the Moscow city limits, and we were in these big 50, 60 passenger buses, and there was us and our counterparts, and then there were these 2 or 3 guys you figure were KGB agents, and then you would get to the border of Moscow, and there would be a guard shack there, and the bus would have to stop. One of those guards would get on and check the papers of every one of the Russians that were in the bus to make sure they were authorized to leave the city. And we were just, holy moly, this is not a good place to want to live. But that was the way they're. I know. I'm sure it's different now, but in the early 70s, that was the way their people had to live. So we went to the museum, and then our interpreters, the white Russian ladies, and their interpreters, who were all in the current crowd, got in this big argument over who was first, and we're all standing around, not being able to understand a word, but telling, it was obviously we thought, well, maybe they're going to fight here. So there was a lot of national pride, I guess, associated with the stuff. So anyway, we would come back, and we would. My counterpart was Victor Blagov, who was, I guess, as best I could understand, he was the Gene Kranz of of the Russian space program. I mean, he was their chief flight director and basically ran their mission control center. So Victor and I were counterparts, and we sort of decided what we want to do, and the objective was to come up with issues that would force the two crews to work together, and or the two control centers to work together, and or all four of them to work together to solve a problem. So they couldn't be sophisticated problems, but pretty much simple. This broke, or this temperature was too high, or this pressure was too low, or whatever. Simple things, but that would force communications between all four things, and those we would run. In addition to that, with the U.S. crew, with Stafford and Vance and Deke, we ran our normal kinds of training exercises as well when we weren't hooked up with the Russians, and we'd do launch aborts and on orbit rendezvous kinds of things where they would just rendezvous with they would be in the simulators down here, and they would just rendezvous with a target, and then we would do the undocking from that target, and then the reentry burns and come back home thing. So we would do all those, plus I can't remember now, I think we did maybe four integrated, totally integrated sims, some of which lasted a couple days. But as far as a young new guy who'd never been out of the U.S., the experience of being in Russia, particularly in that frame, was just astounding. First of all, the Russian people, no matter what their politics were, the Russian people were tremendous, and they loved the space program. I mean, absolutely. We would go places out into the city, and when the grocery store, or we went to the Bolshoi, and we went to eat somewhere, when they found out that we were American space people, they just treat us like we were kings. I mean, they were just as nice and helpful as they could be. If there was, the Russians lived on the lines. You had to stand in line for everything, and they would normally, if they find us, they'd push us to the front of the line in front of everybody else. Where that really helped was at the airport when you were trying to get out, because there'd be lines from there'd be lines from here to downtown for people waiting to get on the airplanes, and some Russian guy would show up, and we'd wander our way through and get to the head of the line and get on the airport. So they liked us. I mean, the Russian people liked us. We'd get over there on the weekends, and we didn't have anything to do because the working group didn't meet weekends. So the Russian, at that time, I haven't been over there since 95 or 6, but at that time the Russian subway system was the model of the world. Stalin had upgraded the subway system at the same time that it basically downgraded all the churches. So he took all the statues and things out of, and the beautiful mahogany pews out of the churches, and he put them in the subway station. So you'd go in the subway station, and there'd be this beautiful furniture and all these things, not a scrap of paper, not a cigarette butt, not anything. I mean, they were just clean. You could eat off the floor in the stations, and probably 10 million people a day were riding those. You'd go in a subway car and you couldn't hardly breathe. There were so many people stuffed in there. But we got a big map of the city for entertainment's sake, and we figured out how to use the subway system, even though we couldn't read any of the language in it because we didn't have any interpreters with us. But we could figure out, we could count the stops, and we'd get a map of the city, and we'd say, well, let's go here, and then we'd go to the subway map and figure out how to get there, and we'd get on this, because subways were all color-coded. We'd get on the right subway, and we'd go to this place, and we'd come up, and we'd wander around, look at all the buildings and all that, go back down, get our map, go some other place. We figured it drove the KGB crazy trying to figure out what we were up to, but it was, entertainment value. And I was talking about the lines. The big store over there was the Goom, and we stayed in the Rosia Hotel, which was right across the street from St. Basil's Cathedral, and it's a gigantic hotel. I mean, 15 or 20 stories and four-sided, and every side was basically a nationality. English were here, the Europeans were here, the Asians were here, and the Russians were here, and they had big doors locked, so you couldn't go around the corner. Every floor had a key lady, and the key to your room was this big wooden thing with the key on it, and I figured it was for full employment, but every floor had a key lady. When you got off the elevator, she had your keys behind her. You told her which one you wanted. She gave us the key. When you left, you better not pass her without giving you your key. It would go back there. And then, we'd look at the light fixtures and wonder where the bug was, anyway, so you go to the Goom, which was right down the street. It was a square block in Moscow, which was a big block, and if you wanted to buy anything, you had to stand in a line to get up to where the display council would be, and the line would normally have 25 or 30 people in. So you work your way up there, and you'd say amber was a big deal in those days. People were buying amber and bringing it back to their secretary, whatever, because a lot of their jewelry was made with amber, and so you'd say, well, I want that and that. And so they give you a piece of paper, and you take the piece of paper and you go over there and get in that line, and which was equally 20, 25 people long, and you pay for it, and they give you another piece of paper, and you go back to the end of this line and get back there and get the, and you'd hand them the paper, and they'd give you whatever you bought. So the system was built obviously to discourage them from spending money on things like that, because they didn't have much, and inflation was incredibly bad. They took us to this outdoor flea market, and I was just wandering around. So I was watching this guy. And he walked up to a counter, and he bought a pack of cigarettes, and he pulled out a wad of money 3 inches in diameter to pay for it, because their money was, they didn't have any money really. So it was, it was an incredibly interesting opportunity for a young person to be exposed to a lifestyle that was so different than over here, and I'm certainly fortunate to have had the opportunity to participate in it. I was talking with, and that's all I'll have to say about that. Maybe you guys have some questions in a minute, but I was talking with Steve about about his presentation. And the one other thing that was significant in the success was when the Mir program came up, and we decided to that we were going to fly with Mir. The people in Washington decided to form a joint committee that would be responsible for sort of overseeing the two programs and making sure that they stayed in sync. And they did form that committee, and Tom Stafford was the initial chairman for the U.S. and Leonov was the Russian guy, and that committee then, as we transitioned out of Shuttle Mir, went to and continued to provide that service, and continue today to provide that service for the space station. Tom obviously passed away. Bob Cabana is now the lead U.S. person, and Krikalev, who's the first Russian to fly on a U.S. spacecraft, is their counterpart. So it's the involvement of in working relationship with the Russians has been really cemented through that recently through that committee. So the flight came, and the last story I'll tell. The flight came, and the flight control team was a standard flight control team, except it had one more position. It was called the Joint Flight Director, and the Joint Flight Director was Frank Littleton, and his job was to serve as the interface between the Russian Control Center and the U.S. Control Center. So anything they needed, wanted, or questions that they had came from their control center through their interpreter to the Joint Flight Director, and then into the flight control team, and vice versa when it went back out. And 2 days before launch, they came in and they said, it just dawned on us that this is a 24-hour operating flight, and the only Joint Flight Director we've got is Frank Littleton, and you're now the second shift Joint Flight Director. Good luck. So I went in, and fortunately that was most of the time when the crew was asleep, and there wasn't too much action except there was one situation with the docking module where there's some uncertainty about the pressures and whether or not there was a leak or just gases settling out, which got Leonov pretty excited and came down through the system and into the Joint Flight Director, which happened to be me at the time, and we had to settle that. But other than that, that part was pretty uneventful. And then the crew separated and began the reentry process. And I'll let John cover that. And I think Marty's got a question there.
Yeah, Jay, we have a question from Dwight Stephen Bonnecki. In searching live TV from orbit, I encountered frustration from the U.S. side at the secrecy of the Russians. Did you find that as the project progressed that the Russian loosened up a bit?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, once, initially it was, everybody was a little bit, I think personally, I think it was more, it more revolved around the language barriers than it did actual actual secrecy or trying to keep secrets. I think there was just so much uncertainty, as Steve mentioned, in the terminology and what word meant, what a word meant in one language versus what it meant in the other. That's kind of slowed down progress early on. It never got completely fixed, but it got much better as the flight went on. And I don't recall any difficulty with that as we got closer and closer to launch. There was a big ditty with when the U.S. cruise team first wanted to go to Baikonur. The Russians weren't interested in letting even the U.S. crew go into Baikonur, and I think it had to do with other military things that they could potentially see, and it kind of got to be a stalemate between Lunny and his counterpart that either we're going to Baikonur or we're going home, kind of a deal that was eventually solved. But Steve may know more instances, but I don't recall any other ones.
Okay, let me just follow on a little bit on the story you were just telling about going to Baikonur. In 1995, when the Russians came over to do the docking adapter for the Mir, they were assigned to me. So I had Vladimir Siremetnikov, who was a student of Korolev, literally parked in my office for 3 months. And that was a very interesting experience. He spoke good English, a very intelligent guy. And he had a crew of about 20 people with him. And one of the first things I did was I took them all out to the pad, and we climbed up the RSS and actually went out onto the roof of the forward RCS room out there on pad 39. And we're looking around at all the view, and the shuttle was sitting right there. And I turned around, and there's this little Russian guy. He was about 5 feet nothing, and tears were streaming down his face. And I said, I was concerned. I said, what's the matter? He said, I work 40 years for a Russian program. I never get to Baikonur. He said, I come to U.S. and you bring me right out to your launch pad. And he was very emotional about it. But anyway, that was just a tag on to your story. My involvement with ASTP goes back. It was kind of strange. I started working on Apollo in 1965 with the first unmanned launches, and worked all through all the manned launches to Apollo 17 as a propulsion engineer. I started off as the RCS guy, finished up as the manager of the group with about 40 people. And then after Apollo 17, I bailed out and went straight to shuttle. So I was working the shuttle in 1972. There were 5 of us at KSC at that time, and that was basically the beginning of the Rockwell shuttle team. And I was 2 years on shuttle before they said, hey, we've run out of people on ASTP. We don't have enough engineers left to handle the launch. Would I go back and work RCS again? So here was a full reversal now, back to my first role 10 years previously as an RCS engineer. And I've got to say, that was probably the most exciting and most satisfying flow I ever had on an Apollo vehicle. We worked one shift. Back when we were going to the moon, we were working 3 shifts, 3 spacecraft. We had 40 guys doing cartwheels around the commode the whole time, trying to keep up with the program, and yet ASTP was a 5-day week, basically a 1-shift operation until you got to the important stuff like the countdown and then servicing. And the morale was really great. We wrote all our own procedures. We checked out all our servicing equipment. We did all the loading procedures. And there was just 2 of us working this whole system. And we'd had 20 back in the old days. So, and we got to know the techs really well, and the inspectors. Morale was high. And it was just a great, I'd love to have just stayed in that role forever. It was a lot of fun. But there were couple of things happened on that mission that really bothered me, and they both concern Vance Brand. He was the rookie of the 5 astronauts, and Vance was, I had the highest respect for him, and afterwards he turned out to be probably the longest serving commander of a space shuttle. I think he flew 3 flights as commander. But he screwed up a couple of times on ASTP, one of them very seriously. The first one occurred in the countdown, and I'm on station and we're arming the RCS system for flight. And that involves basically just opening the prop ISO valves and dumping fluids down to the engines so that the RCS thrusters are all primed, ready to go. And for ASTP and for Skylab also, we had added 18 additional RCS tanks to the Apollo, giving us a total of 38 tanks. Now, people say, why did it take so long to service hypergolics? I said, because we have 38 tanks. The cryo guys come along with one great big tank and they just jam it all in at full bore. We got to screw around and load every tank individually, do a PV test to determine how much we put on board. And what we did for ASTP, we had these 18 additional tanks. And what Vance did in the countdown, Skip Chauvin was the test conductor. He went down through the switch list, and Vance got his switches screwed up. Instead of opening the PSM, or the propellant service storage module valves, he opened the quad valves, which fed directly into the four quads around the service module. What that did was trap a large amount of gas between the engines and the ring manifold, and which in flight would give you erratic firing of the RCS thrusters, and there'd be times when that could be really bad. So here we are at T-minus 30 minutes in the countdown, and there's no feedback, there's no switch positions in the control room, but I could tell from the pressures on the tanks that he'd done it incorrectly. And I'm struggling there with what do I do about this, and I went back to Skip, and I said, Skip, he cycled the switches in the wrong order. And Skip got with the Mission Control Center. I don't know whether you were involved or not, Jay, back then, but that we had to scramble and come up with a decision. It's okay to go ahead and fly, but we needed to generate a new procedure to do a purge burn in flight. Now, Mission Control don't like changes, especially at 30 minutes. So, they were really ticked off about this, and I felt kind of sorry for Vance. He was apologetic. But we did, in fact, do that, and in flight, I think it was on day 2, they did have to recycle all those switches and do a purge, what they call a purge burn, and that involved firing all 8 roll thrusters, plus and minus, at once. And that blew all that gas out of the system without, hopefully, directing the spacecraft into any new position. So that was the first incident that I thought, oh boy, I'm not used to having an astronaut make a mistake like that. But the bad one was during re-entry. And this is not talked about very much. You don't hear about it a lot. But the crew are coming in. They've gone through the bad re-entry phase. They're at 30,000 feet. And Stafford, Tom gave Vance the switches he needed to throw for the Earth Landing System, ELS. And for some reason, that communication didn't go through. And I've talked to both those guys since then, and Tom said there was too much background noise, and Vance said, I screwed up. Again, Vance was honest, but even so, he should have known what his switch requirements were without Stafford having to tell him. So anyway, this was supposed to have happened at 30,000 feet. At 24,000 feet, what the Earth Landing System should have done was deployed the drogues and the chutes. Nothing's happening. They're barreling in towards Earth, and there's no drogues out. And Deke Slayton said, hey, we need to deploy the drogues manually. So they did deploy the drogues manually, but they still hadn't put the Earth Landing System on the line. And the other thing that system would have done, the automatic system, would have shut down the RCS thrusters. So the thrusters are still active. So now the drogues have streamed out, and the spacecraft is swinging on the drogues. And the thrusters are saying, oh, geez, fire this, fire that, fire that. They're trying to straighten it out. So the thrusters are firing like crazy, and Tom Stafford knew, hey, they're not supposed to be doing that. So instead of looking at maybe Earth landing system, he closed the propellant isolation valves, which shut off the tankage to the thrusters, but left all the propellant in the manifolds. So as the thrusters continued to try and fire, that propellant ran out. And instead of causing a fire in the thruster for thrust, it started just coming out as a fluid. And nitrogen tetroxide comes out as a big red cloud. And at 24,000 feet, the cabin vent valve automatically opens to allow ambient air back into the vehicle. So now you've got a thruster dumping nitrogen tetroxide right next to a cabin valve that is allowing it to flow back into the cockpit. So sure enough, it's a red cloud, it's going back into the cockpit. And the guys' eyes are starting to smart, and their lips are stinging. And I think it was at about 11,000 feet, they're still streaming on the drogues. And and Tom realized then that they'd forgotten the Earth landing system switch, and they closed them then, and also manually released the chutes at the same time. So the chutes came out, and the vehicle landed. Well, right after that, Vance Brand passed out from the oxidizer. This is really bad stuff. It gets in your lungs, and it forms nitric acid. You know, and it doesn't take a lot to kill you. So Vance was unconscious, and the other two guys were feeling really bad. And they came down and hit the water, and as luck would have it, they went into stable 2. Stable 2 is the vehicle turns upside down. So they're now hanging on their couches in a 1G atmosphere, feeling sick. Vance had come around. Tom had put emergency oxygen on him, and he'd come around. And the balls opened up, and we caused it to roll back into the right position. And they went ahead, and the crew were not rescued, but taken out of the vehicle and put on the carrier. And if you ever look at those photos of the crew sitting there on the carrier, they were sitting there like this. They were not happy campers. And what happened is they had to terminate that session on the carrier deck. They went to the dispensary, and then they were helicoptered to Hawaii, and they were in hospital for 2 weeks. Now, we started off the Apollo program with a fire that killed 3 astronauts, and we damn nearly finished up the end of the program where we killed 3 astronauts. So it's a story that it's out there, but it's not talked about. But it was a very serious issue. Like I said, Vance went on to greater things. He went on to command 3 different shuttle missions, and it was a bad day, but it turned out, luckily for all 3 of them and for the nation as a whole, that it was nobody lost their lives. Yeah.
Great story. Thank you so much. And you had touched on communications a little bit in that story. We had a question from our YouTube comments regarding the ATS-6 satellites, wondering if either of y'all were involved in the development or use of that.
I certainly wasn't. I
never even heard of it.
Sorry.
Thank you.
My wife makes fun of me because she said, I'm always so focused. I'm so focused on RCS. Jay did all the other odd systems, things like avionics and life support and all the important stuff.
I just did the simulated version of it. There was some issue with the -X thrusters. The Russians didn't want us using I think it's the -X thrusters on a CSM if it was near the
cabin vent valve.
Yeah, it was near the Soyuz.
One thruster was right next to the cabin vent valve. That's what was the problem.
Yeah, and there's some agreement had to be made. They wouldn't use them, or it was something. It had something to do with the -X thrusters. So I was wondering when you said when they fired them all, that was before they were docked.
That was back. I think it was day 2 before they docked. Yeah.
With all the time in prepping for the mission that they do in the simulators, and then everybody in the control center watching them when they're re-entry, you know, why didn't one of the three of them think, hey, we've already passed that point where the drogue chutes should have been out, and everyone that's watching for them in the sky should have said, hey, they're at the level, where's their chutes?
I
And
don't
no
I
one
think
asked
that's-
that question.
I think they're still too high, Terry, to be observed from the ground, and I don't think any of the cameras would catch the drogues coming out at that back in those days.
Yes.
You know, today we expect to see everything on film of the whole flight, whole mission.
Yeah,
And
and I mean, and the number of times that they would work in a simulator doing all that, it's hard to believe that three people of that caliber, one of
Well,
them
you-
would say, wait a minute, we should have already done it, because they're
Well,
thinking
that's
in
what
their
you know.
head.
Deke effectively did. You know, they should have deployed at 30,000 feet.
Yes.
And 6,000 feet at that speed is no time at all. When Deke's saying, "Hey, we should have had the drogues out,"
Yeah.
and that's when they started doing
Yeah,
manual
and
corrections.
I don't know which if any of those switches were on the telemetry stream either. So I don't know if in the control center they would even have been aware that was going on.
I don't think so. No, that was just, I mean, back in those days. The instrumentation was not good, because that was always the first casualty. Whenever you're designing a spacecraft, you know, you're always worried about weight. Weight drives everything. And the first thing they take out is they do a big review, and they say, oh, well, you don't need that instrumentation. You don't need that. We can figure out this by some other way. And that was a bane of our life all through Apollo. Was like I couldn't tell that he's throwing the wrong switches before the launch because I had no switch indications.
And through shuttle as well.
Yep,
They were doing
it's the
some
same thing.
extending mods, and they took out things that we thought from ground support was critical.
Yep.
But yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. I thought you were going to ask me something about tile.
Not on this show.
Wonderful stories here. Any questions in our audience in here? Don't have anything to ask there. I've heard Tom Stafford in public talk several times about the incident where they're hanging upside down, you know,
Yeah.
the conical shape, the heat shield up, and he had to literally jump kind of down into the bay to grab the mask to put over Vance's face on there to get the oxygen going on there. Had never heard too much about how Deke got through that, but
Yeah, well, they all lived for a long time afterwards.
yeah,
so
they did. That's amazing. Like you said, Vance is 94. But very. What?
There's a question. Maybe.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Go ahead, Emily.
I'm sorry. It's not really a question. I wrote an article a few years ago, and it was about Dick Slayton reaction to that incident. And I guess what happened was when the divers got by him, he didn't, instead of signaling they were in distress, he accidentally did that. So the divers assumed they were okay, and he called it, I can't say the word because we're live, but he called it a dumb SH move in the story. So.
I did have a comment on speaking of Deke on the session you had the other day with Granath. There was
Oh yeah, Bob Granath.
there was a
doing a history of ASTP.
There was a
yes.
question of what Deke's management responsibilities were at JSE, and when Dr. Gilruth was the center director, he had basically 4, I think, directorates that reported directly to him. One of them was operations, and Chris Kraft ran that, and one of them was engineering, and Max Faget ran that, and then there was the center things and the procurement things, and the final one was flight crew operations, and that's what Deke ran, and then after Shepard's flight, he became the chief of the Shepard became the chief of the astronaut office, and he remained that until he retired, and then when when shuttle came along, Deke, he was the I guess you'd call him the project manager for the ALT program, and also the program manager for the first 4 flights, the phase 1 of shuttle, the four flights that had only two crewmen because they had the ejection seats in them. And then when that phase was over, Deke retired, and I can't remember exactly when Shepard retired, but then John Young took over the office, and John kept the office until STS-1. She got assigned. One of the values of being the chief of the astronaut office is you get to assign the flight crews. So that's why a lot of people like that job. John was the last guy in that office that really was really an engineer, and then he was a pilot. The rest of them were pilots, have been pilots. So John, I mean, Terry will remember, and John will remember 100 flight readiness reviews or other reviews that were held for shuttle, where John would have questions about why are we doing this, why are we doing that. His favorite one was on FRFs, flight readiness firings, which were a big deal. You know, you roll a shuttle out there and you had 3 engines, and you basically burped the engines for a few seconds and then turned them off. And they would do that before each, early on anyway, they would do it before each vehicle's flight. Well, John wanted to do it after every time you changed an engine out. He said, well, you change the engine out on an airplane, you do a FRF. This is an airplane. We ought to do that with this one too. And everybody said, well, yeah, we can, John, but that's technically correct, but programmatically impractical. So we're not going to do that. But he was a voice of the engineering side of the programs that, in my opinion, doesn't exist anymore.
I'd always try and make a point of sitting with him at the FRFs because he was entertaining.
Yes,
he would mumble the whole time, just loud enough you could barely hear it, until he got George Abbey's attention.
Yeah,
and then George would turn around and say, "John, if you got something to say, get up and say it."
Yeah, but I mean, everything he said was true, but a lot of it was in fact impractical. I asked George one time why. Well, there's a lot of saviors of the Apollo program, and one of the biggest was George Low, who at the time of the fire, he was the NASA deputy administrator. And when they decided what they were going to do about the fire, Dr. Fletcher convinced Lowe to go down to Houston and become the Apollo spacecraft program manager. And he really was the savior of the program. And George Abbey was his right hand. In the sense that every time George would make a decision, George Lowe would make a decision, George Abbey would write it up. And of course he wrote up like George Abbey thought it ought to be written. But anyway, I asked George Abbey why he had such faith in John, because if John said something, George 99 times out of 100 he agreed with him. And I said, well, why is that so? And he said, well, when George Lowe was on his deathbed and dying with cancer in the hospital in Houston, George Abbey and John went to see him, and when they were getting ready to leave, John went out first, and George Lowe turned to Abbey and said, that man's the best engineer we got. Always listen to him. And he did.
Great story there, Jay. Appreciate that. John Tribe, being British and having family over there during all this, did you get a sense of the international pulse of this? Was Europe excited about this cooperation as a détente that Nixon had orchestrated, or what was
I'm sure it was, but I mean, I'm over here. I've been here a long time by then, so my family were interested in what I was doing, but the détente aspect of it, I didn't sense it. But I'm sure that the rest of the world did.
But the general thought process of all the people that worked on all these programs was, I'm working on this program and that's what I'm worried with, and I don't really know what's going on in those other places. I mean, we grew up with, Vietnam was going on, and if you got home early enough to catch the news, you saw some stuff, but people didn't pay much attention to outside things because they were so busy and so dedicated or committed to making these programs work. Again, you don't see that. I don't see that today. We worked, as I mentioned earlier, 6 days a week, and then prepared on the 7th. And now you got people working from Key West and Galveston and Lord knows where else, and not in their office building, and you wonder why. Why does it take so long to do all this stuff? Why come these programs cost so much? Well, as old man's view, the commitment's not there. Not there. Not only in the workforce, it's not there all the way to the top. And one of these days, the next voice you hear from the moon ain't going to be American. So if you want to understand the next voice from the moon, you damn well better learn Chinese.
Yes, and we'll save that for another panel.
You heard it here.
Yeah, right. I wanted to just share a little bit about how this 50 years ago bridged to today. One story in the cooperation with Russia that, of course, began with the Mir space station again, but that may not have happened, I understand, if it had not been for Mr. George Abbey really jumping on the fall of the Soviet Union into Russia. And I understand that he was a big promoter immediately of building that relation up that led to the Mir missions.
Yeah, well, he was an unannounced member of the Stafford Committee. I mean, George and Tom, those two together, from the operations point of view, held the program together through the not only through Mir but post Mir and all the issues that went on early on with station, both in the development and the early operations. I mean, I don't think there's anybody that has any question about the contribution that both of them made to where we are today.
We have any questions, Raj, on the line there? Did you look around, or anybody else here?
was any consideration of having the ASTP crew check on the Skylab workshop.
I don't think so, but I don't. I mean, they probably had some input into some of the design issues, but I think formally they probably not. There was one earlier. There was some of the cartoons that were shown, and my favorite one, I guess, is part of the initial agreement with the with the Russians for Apollo Soyuz. There was some kind of a grain deal made where we sent. They had a bad year. The farmers had a bad year over there or something, and we had agreed to send a lot of grain to Russia. So we got over there, and there was this cartoon in the Russian newspaper. And the translation was the two Russians were standing on the street, and one says to the other, "I don't understand this. We're telling them we're giving them our space secrets, and all we're getting in return is some grain."
There was one thing that came out of ASTP, Mark, that Philip Morris over here and the Russian cigarette company over in well, I guess it was the Soviet Union at the time, not Russia, but they collaborated and put out a cigarette pack. And
Show
it's
that up close there to the camera.
it's an Apollo Soyuz, and when Vladimir Suryatnikov was over visiting me in 1995, he gave me this as a souvenir, and he had it signed by Leonov. And then later on, I got Tom to sign it as well. So the two commanders signed this, and I'd like to give that to you to put in the museum. Okay.
Well, thank you. Bless your heart there. Thank you very much. We will accept that. And now,
Well, Chuck told me earlier that you'd had one at one time,
Yeah.
and it got stolen.
actually, it did.
So make sure that one doesn't get
We
stolen.
will
Okay.
make sure that. That's why we're getting new security cameras even.
All right.
So, did they smoke in space on this mission?
No, they produced those cigarettes until the 1990s, I think.
All right. But Jay, the Apollo Soyuz, I think when Norm Thagard first went up there, did he not be a little surprised that the Russians lit up a smoke after a meal?
I never heard that. It is a kind of interesting story though. When Norm got assigned to that flight, he was to be the first U.S. astronaut to fly on a Russian launch on a Russian spacecraft on Soyuz. And I was down here at that time, and in January, my good friend George Abbey convinced Dan Golden was administrator then. My good friend George Abbey convinced Golden that I should go to Russia to review their system and make sure that it was safe for Norm to fly on their thing. So I went. I thought George was going with me, but when I got to the airport in Dulles, I looked around and there was no George. So I thought he got me again. So anyway, I go over there, and it was actually a two objective meeting. This was when the USSR had broken up, and part of what went away was Kazakhstan, and part of what was in Kazakhstan was Baikonur. So the question was, who's going to run Baikonur, because the Red Army had run it since its inception, and the question was who was going to be in charge of Baikonur. So several of us, Jed Pearson, who was associate administrator at headquarters, and 2 or 3 other headquarters people. We went over, and the first place we went was to the capital of Almaty, which is the capital of Kazakhstan, which, by the way, is is about as far from Moscow as Moscow is from here. And we met with their space guy was a former cosmonaut, and he assured us that the Red Army was going to continue to run under an agreement that they had with the Russian government. He was going to continue to run. That the Red Army would continue to run Baikonur as they had always done. So then, and we had the NASA airplane, the NASA Gulfstream, and we had flown from Washington to Moscow on it, and from Moscow to Almaty on it. And then they said, well, you can go to Baikonur, but you can't take you. So our pilots asked for the flight map so they could find the place. They said, well, you can't have them. You can't take your airplane there. You have to fly on our airplane. So we have to get on their airplane and fly back halfway to Moscow, and then had our session with them and go back to there to get our airplane and come back to Moscow. But they weren't going to let our pilots in. But anyway, so I get out there and I get a tour of the Baikonur launch place, and it's cold. I mean, it's like 15 below. And they had this big building, and it had all their launch vehicles, because they were several unmanned things they were launching out of there as well, and they were all stacked up in this big building, and then the Soyuz vehicle was in there with the spacecraft attached to it, and the way they did it is they rolled out in a horizontal all the way to the pad, and when they got to the pad, they propped it up and tied it down and launched it. So all the rest of those guys stay in the bus, and they kicked me out to go talk to this Red Army colonel to understand the sequence of how everything was going to work, including the probably, I don't know how little known fact it is. Maybe he only knows more than that, but there's a tradition over there that because when Gagarin flew the first time, when he went from the preparatory building to the pad, he all of a sudden had the urge to go to the bathroom, so he stopped behind a tree, relieved himself, and went on to the thing. Well, that then became a tradition, and every pilot that was going to fly had to stop behind this tree. So I mean, I got that whole 9 yards explained to me, and by now it's snowing, and this Red Army guy had this gigantic beard, and he had his little beaver hat thing on, and it's cold. I mean, it was really cold. And I'm sitting there watching the snowflakes build up on his beard, and the guys in the bus are all blowing the horn because they were cold, sitting inside the bus for me to hurry up. And the guy's going through all the thing, and finally, and I had an interpreter out there with me, and finally I said, look, do you guys know what you're doing? And he said, yeah. He said, we're doing exactly the same thing we've done for every launch since Yuri Gagarin. We're following the same procedures with basically the same equipment, same processes. And I said, that's good enough for me. Get me back in the bus. And that's the way they, as mentioned earlier, sophistication wasn't high on their list of things I want to go do. Over here we got we built an engine And for one program, we decided we want another program that takes twice as big a engine. We develop another engine. Over there, they do the same things. They take the first engine and bolt it to another one just like it, and then they go off and fly. You know, I mean, that's their philosophy. They got build in plenty of margin, and they get things done. I mean, it's not our way of doing it, but our way of doing it spurs development and spurs new ideas and new things and new capabilities, but theirs works just as good. You know, most people think, as I think. And in the space business, they remain our friends, and those of us who were pretty intimately involved with it never could figure out why our State Department didn't seem to care what it was we did to get along with them, because they were going to do things their own way, and I think that kind of attitude still exists probably today.
Thanks, Jay. Terry White's got a question.
I actually have a comment in that. First time I met Tom Stafford was in the orbiter processing facility, and they asked me to escort him around. And so as we're walking around, I asked him, did he have any questions about the orbiter and the shuttle? And he says, as a matter of fact, I know a little bit about it. He says, I was one of the group that went to convince Congress that we needed to fund the shuttle program, and it only passed Congress by one vote. But yeah, he was very, prominent in doing that. And then a comment about John Young, you were right. He was an engineer first. Mm-hmm. He'd be in a meeting where John was in there, and you knew he had a question. And when he asked a question, it would stump a lot of people in there to look around for the answer in that. But because STS-1 was delayed 2 years, John had been trained for the flight, so he had a lot of time on his hands. So he would come to Kennedy Space Center, and he'd come down to the floor. I happened to be a second shift supervisor in that, and he would come to me and he'd say, Terry, is it all right if I walk around and talk to your people? And I said, yeah, John. I said, just check in with me when you want to do it, so I make sure there's no hazardous operations going on to brief you, but you got the numbers. You're allowed in here to go around. I said, but don't wear your blue flight suit. I said, come in your civilian clothes. And he goes, okay. And shortly after that, he came and he said, can I go talk? I said, sure. I said, some of them may not answer a lot of questions for you. Others of them will talk all night if you let them. But so he disappeared. About 45 minutes later, one of my techs comes down to me and he says, the strangest thing just happened. I said, what was that? He said, this guy came up to me and he asked, could he sit down next to me and asked some questions about what I was doing. And he said, I told him, sure. He said, so he sat there for more than 30 minutes looking at my paperwork, asking me what I was doing, and, went through the whole thing. And he said, then when he was out of questions, he just stood up, told me thanks, and walked off. He goes, who in the hell was that? I go, that was John Young. He's the commander of this flight. But that's the kind of thing he liked to do. He liked to come around and meet the techs and ask them to explain exactly what they were doing, so he had a knowledge of all the different tasks that he could view. So,
well, and then they started coming down and wearing their flight suits, yes. And they were in and out of every building, talking to everybody that you could find. Several times during a flow for each one of the flights. This young man works out there. He's been out there 3 years, works in the VAB and out at the pad. He's never seen a blue suit.
That's one of the things that I asked the crews, because after the shuttle flights, not in the early days, but later on in the program, after the shuttle flights and the astronauts had been through their sessions in Houston and that, they would come down here as a group. They would come to the orbiter processing facilities and they would want to meet with the engineers, the technicians, the quality, the flow management, and talk to them about their flight. And they would show us their own home movies. This was not the ones that were made up for NASA, and they would talk about it. And they would tell us what they liked about their flight and what they didn't like about their flight. So there were certain things that we could look at improving or explain why it had to be that way and that. But then after a while, we realized that they're not seeing a lot of the other people. It's not just the orbiter processing facility. I mean, we have the orbiter, so we have the biggest piece of the pie, but all the other facilities and operations around the Space Center. So I convinced them, I said, look, you can come here and talk, but you need to send somebody over to talk to the high crew, to the crane crew, to all these other people that are a very important part of this program. And they go, you're right. So they started doing that so that they would get to see an astronaut, come in and thank them for what they did for that flight.
But they ain't doing it. My point is they ain't doing it now.
No, they're not.
Well, we're enjoying this great conversation. Any questions in the room here?
Yes,
Mark,
please go
yes,
on.
sure.
Yeah, not so much a question as a comment. We were just talking a few minutes ago about the trips up to the Mir space station. Norm Thagard that made that first trip. It just so happens that today and tomorrow he's going to be at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex.
Oh, cool.
So if you'd like to meet him, it's today and tomorrow. He'll do 2 programs a day and 2 autograph sessions and little chat with sessions and such. So there you go.
Yes, he's he likes to talk too. He's a good one out there. Jay, you had something to say?
No.
Enjoyed this program here. Any other questions in here? Yes.
I have a follow-up question for Terry. What was your reasoning for telling John Young not to go in his flight suit?
Because the minute they show up in a blue suit, then all of a sudden everybody's coming to him for autographs and that, and they don't get to ask questions and just be one of the troops. So because he showed up in civilian clothes, he could walk up there, and like I said, that guy didn't even recognize who he was. In a blue suit, he'd have recognized he was an astronaut. But I said, just walk around like that. Some of them will figure out right away who you are, and others of them won't. It's just like when you came down to work on the floor. Yeah,
I was going to say we have an undercover boss here.
Yes, that's right. It was take the boss to work day, and Jay came down to the OPF, and we didn't tell anybody who he was, and we assigned him to a technician. It happened to be a female mechanic in the aft section of the orbiter. But she took him through the whole process of what she had to do from the start of the shift, getting her paperwork, everything to do with the job and that. And he went along with her, and he went inside the aft with her, and he spent close to 4 hours with that morning. It didn't take long for them to figure out because they went out to the badge board and figured out who is this guy, But still, they went, and he got to see it from the technician's point of view, what they had to go through to do the work. He enjoyed it so much, at least he told me he did that day, that he said, I want to come back. So we brought him back to work in the mid-body, to work in the forward crew compartment area, and to work as a tile technician.
Yeah, I took a tile off. I still got it. They gave me.
Yeah, I've
they
seen that in your
saved my
trophy
tile,
case,
and
Jay.
they gave me a tile. I also, the scariest thing, I worked in the aft with the Rocketdyne guys, and they probably shouldn't have let me back there because there was a lot of really stuff you had to be really careful around. But as Terry said, it gives you a better appreciation of what these guys are thinking. And the blue suits are wonderful, but they can't do what they do without that team out there doing what it does.
Great comments. Any others here? Got anything on board there, line there? To end our wonderful program here of retrospective of Peace on Earth Orbit 50 years ago, still going on today. Both of you gentlemen, I'll put you on the spot to look in your crystal ball. The ISS is wanting to be deorbited sometime around 2030 in 5 or 6 years. Will that be the end of American-Russian relationships in space?
Well, this thing's set up right now. Probably so, although I would hope that some cooler heads look at what we have planned for the future and do some serious thinking about is that the right way to go if we in fact want to go back to the moon, because in my own judgment and that of a lot of people I know, the plan their own is not very good. So maybe maybe a rethinking of the process and including the Russians might be something that could come out of that. We'll see now as far as the station, how long it lasts is kind of TBD. I don't know how much I know about the Russian module, but I understand it has a big crack in it that at any moment could become a bigger crack, which would require, at best, they seal it off somehow or another. And there's a contract out to SpaceX to build some sort of a deorbit capability that would allow you to target where the thing's going to go, whether or not that maintains any kind of a schedule or not. I guess it's TBD as well. So it would be nice to get an administrator. We have another politician as an acting administrator, and 4 of the last 5 administrators we've had have been politicians. In the whole history of NASA, there was only one other one, and that was Jim Webb, who was the first one. And to expect that our nation's space program is going to flourish without technical leadership at the top, to me, is pretty problematic.
Yes, not a lot of MBAs in those top tiers, and not enough engineers, it seems like there. Yes, another question here from Steve.
Yeah, just I know people are talking about what happens right now. The tentative date for the deorbiting of the station is 2030. It used to be before that, and every time you get closer to the date, it keeps on moving back. So one of the things we've had to look at is what's next. You can't say that the space research is so important and all of a sudden in 2030 it's just going to die. It's going pretty much commercial. Right now there's 4 different companies. Axiom Space, which has been sending crews up to the International Space Station, they're going to build something called the Axiom Station. It's supposed to have a max crew of 8. They're hoping to get that in orbit by 2028. It's supposed to have 4 modules and 3 additional to be later to come up later. Haven 1 is by the Vast Company in California, and that is supposed to have 1 big habitation module. Orbital Reef is another company. That's a combination of Blue Origin and Sierra Space. They're going to have 3 rigid modules, 1 inflatable, and that's supposed to be by 2030. And then Starlab, another company, and that's European Airbus and Voyager, and supposed to have a crew of 4, 1 rigid module, and that's supposed to be launched by a Starship. So, I mean, there's a lot of private companies hoping to carry out that mission. So hopefully we'll get together then.
Yeah, it's also a lot of UGRAVs.
Oh, yeah, same.
And none of them Russian.
Yeah.
John, what do you think about deorbiting the ISS? Is that the end of relationships with Russia in the space program?
Based on the political atmosphere today, yes. Two problems. One is, the animosity that exists right now between Putin and Trump, and it's building up. And secondly, the Russian technical skills have dwindled. They're having a lot of technical issues, and like Jay says, their station module is starting to fail. And I think I don't think there's a good follow-on plan for them to join with any other nation, maybe China, possibly with a lot of financial help from the East. But no, I don't think the USA and Russia will have anything in the near future.
Thank you. China was trying to cooperate with Russia until this invasion of Ukraine also set back some plans on the moon there and so forth. And we do want to continue to go to the moon with Artemis, and Russia has got no place to go. Maybe after 2031, what would they be doing in space with no plans? Jay, you had something to say?
No, I was going to say something about Artemis, but I won't do that.
All right, he's a lot like that. See, that's why he was the boss, is he knows to check himself there. I've enjoyed this thoroughly. I know everybody watching on our Streamlabs has. Tell your friends it's up there anytime they want to watch it. A program from two NASA legends here. Is there anything we didn't cover that you'd like to get across there, Mr. John Tribe?
There's one little story that just adds to what we talked about earlier, and that was the relationship between Tom Stafford and Alexei Leonov. That was really close. And Alexei actually arranged for Tom to adopt 2 Russian children. And one time, Tom had me doing a tour for him and his Russian son, who had become very Americanized, spoke very good English, but he brought his sister over from Russia, and she spoke no English whatsoever. And I'm touring them around, and we're out at Pad B, and a gator came up the bank behind them, and I've got all these photographs of the two like this. Looking over their shoulder, but that was kind of an interesting situation. And that same tour, Tom said, "I want to go to Pad 19," because that's where he launched Gemini.
Yeah, he was the mayor of Pad 19.
Yep.
Technically, they teased him.
Tom, that's not. It hadn't been run by the Air Force. I can't just go over there. Yes, you can. Yes, come on, we can do that. And here's a 3-star general, national icon. And I'm just a little peasant guy, running around the base. And I said, okay, well, if you want to really do it, I guess we'll go do it. And we went over to 19, and the gates closed right across the pad. But the fence didn't go all the way around. The fence only ran about 20 feet, and then it stopped in the boondocks. So we start wading off through this thick undergrowth. And I'm thinking, oh, God, he's going to get hit by a rattlesnake. I'm going to be in so much trouble. Anyway, we go all the way around and we climb up onto the stack. And at that time, the tower was still there. The tower was laying down and it was eaten up with rust. And you could stand beside it and you could hear it. Pink, donk, ping, ping, things just falling off the tower, And Tom says, oh, I want a souvenir. So here's this, he was about 80 years old at the time. He climbs over the rail and he starts wading through all this debris, trying to find a piece of stainless steel tubing that he can bend and snap off as a souvenir. And he gets one, and he's over there. And I'm standing up there, and you're high at that point, and I'm looking out, and I'm thinking, oh, the MPs are on their way. They've got to be. TV cameras are all everywhere. Somebody's bound to have seen me. And I just knew I was in big trouble. But surprisingly, nobody showed up, and he got his stainless steel, and then he called me up that night at home, and he says, hey, I left it in the van. Said, can you bring it down? So I had to drive on down there and give it to him.
Bring it to me at the Fat Snook, right?
That was Tom. And of course, in his later years, he was really eaten up with scoliosis. And you do it, I'd walk around with him, and by the end of the day, I was eaten up with scoliosis because you spend the whole day bending over talking to him. And it was a sad situation.
Yeah, but his mind never slowed down. And people don't know the contribution he made to this country. He's a great guy.
Tremendous contribution out at Edwards Air Force Base when he was over that after his astronaut career. Do yourselves a favor and put the Tom Stafford Museum on your bucket list in Weatherford, Oklahoma, his hometown.
I'll tell you one more.
Of course, yes.
One more Tom story. When in 1977, we were I was working for Abby, and we were picking. We were going to pick the shuttle astronauts, the first group, and I was George's hey boy on the source board, and I was the interface with the military, I dealt with the Navy guy who gave us the Navy and the Marine candidates for us to consider, and then there was an Air Force guy out at Randolph that gave you the Air Force guys, and we had a guy that was that had been early on. There had been an agreement with the actually back in Apollo. There had been an agreement with NASA and the Air Force that the Air Force was eventually going to have their own shuttle and their own capability, and they would have their own control center, and they were going to have their own program. So they sent a bunch of like lieutenants down to first lieutenants and captains down to JSC, and a bunch of them ended up in flight control. And so one of them was a guy that was a really young guy, and so we got ready to interview, and he said, call that Air Force guy and tell him what we want that, I forget his name, Lieutenant, to consider for the program. And so I called the guy, and he called me back, and he said, well, no, he's been out at the Flight Test Center at Edwards, and he's now has orders. This was like on a Wednesday. He's got orders Monday to report to Greenland, and everything's done. It's packed. His house is packed. His things are being moved, and so I went back to George. Him being a person that never was a good answer. He said, well, call Tom. And that Tom at that time was the 3-star out at Edwards. So I called Stafford, and I said, we want Crimmins. We want this guy Crimmins to interview. And he said, oh, okay. So he hung up, and about literally an hour later, the guy from Randolph called, and I answered the phone, and he said, who do you know? And I said, I ain't telling you. Well, he said, anyway, Crimmins will be there. We've canceled Crimmins' orders, and he'll be coming down to Houston for an interview. Of course, we didn't pick him, but they took him as a flight controller, so he's been a hit there. But Tom had a lot of influence. And one other short story, since you were asking the other day for Stafford stories, when the group was 78, the 78 astronauts showed up. Dave Walker was one of them, and out at Ellington we had a B-57 high altitude reconnaissance type airplane, and it was used in a program of crop inventory experimental thing where they were trying to fly over these fields up in North Dakota and there and watch the various stages of growth of the crops. Anyway, the B-57 was a good usable aircraft, and out at Ames they had a U-2 that they were flying that was running out of airtime, and so George says to me and Walker, "You go figure out why we shouldn't just use the B-57 and not buy NASA shouldn't buy this U-2." So we did. We put together a sterling presentation, absolutely bulletproof. Clearly, the B-57 is the best thing. Went and presented it to headquarters, and they bought the U-2 replacement anyway, which was called the TR-1. So this is in 1979 or so. So fast forward to the Challenger accident, and I was up at headquarters in working with Truly, and we had a watering hole down in Old Town that Tom frequented often, and so I'm in there one night, and Tom gets to telling this story about how he and Hans Mark, who back at the time this study on the B-57 went for, Hans Mark was the deputy administrator, and Tom goes into this long story about how he and Mark agreed to buy the TR-1 so that they could get the production line started, so they could make more of the airplanes. And I said, "Well, you son of a gun." For 10 years I've been wondering why in the world our can't miss pitch got so little response, and turns out it was their contest in the first place. But he was a doer. Tom Stafford was an incredible doer.
And like I said, outside of Oklahoma City on I-40 is his hometown of Weatherford. I've been to his museum many times, and a lot of Russian artifacts there, including a lot of vodka bottles signed by a lot of astronauts and VIP. You may have even signed a vodka bottle there, Jay. Next time I'm there, I'll look for your signature.
No.
Okay. Well, thank you both gentlemen here. Let's give them a big hand. Mr. John Tribe, Mr. Jay Honeycutt, both tremendous supporters of the American Space Museum and doing a unique program today that we don't think anybody's really acknowledging this piece on Earth orbit 50 years ago like we have. So thank you all very much. This will conclude our program. We remind you all that our Stay Curious program Monday through Friday interviews space workers. We've had these two gentlemen on many times, and we'll have them on in the future. And we hope that you tell your friends to share and look at our content, very important to our nonprofit here. So until next time, I'm Mark Marquette, and I'm going to say to you all that we will see you again to bridge the space between us. Thank you very much.